The attic that whispers. I've never been superstitious, but everyone has a line. For me, that line was crossed the night I inherited my grandparents' house. It wasn't the creaky floors or the faded wallpaper that made my skin crawl. It was the attic. The house was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and miles of silence. My grandparents had passed away within weeks of each other, leaving behind the sprawling old property. It fell to me because no one else in the family wanted it. My parents refused to explain why. "You'll see," was all my father had said. I arrived on a frigid December evening, snow blanketing the ground. The house loomed in the moonlight, its black windows staring down like empty eye sockets. I tried to ignore the unease prickling at the back of my neck as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like dust and something faintly metallic. The furniture was still covered with white sheets, and the grandfather clock in the hall ticked away as if nothing had changed. The place was a time capsule. I spent the first hour exploring, trying to get a feel for my temporary home. Everything seemed normal until I reached the attic door. It was at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor, its chipped paint and rusty handle standing out against the clean lines of the rest of the house. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I turned away and made my way to the kitchen. I'd deal with the attic later. Or so I thought. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps overhead. It was subtle at first, a soft creak that could have been the house settling. But then it grew louder, distinct, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth across the attic floor. I froze in bed, my heart pounding. The house was locked, and no one else was supposed to be here. "Just the wind," I whispered to myself. But the footsteps didn't stop. Summoning what little courage I had, I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept down the hall. The attic door loomed at the end, and the sound of pacing grew louder with each step I took. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I stared at the door, waiting for something, a reply, the sound of someone running. But all I heard was silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I retreated to bed, though it took hours to fall asleep. The next day, I tried to ignore the attic. I busied myself cleaning the kitchen and unpacking my suitcase. The snowstorm outside intensified, trapping me inside. As the day wore on, the unease in my chest grew. Every time I walked past the attic door, I felt its presence. It was like the air around it was heavier, colder. By nightfall, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the howling wind outside. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, more insistent. They didn't come from the attic itself, but from somewhere just beyond it, as if the voices were trying to push through the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate, pleading. I sat in the living room, clutching a mug of cold coffee, trying to drown out the noise with the TV. But no matter how high I turned the volume, the whispers wormed their way into my ears. "Stop it," I muttered, pressing my palms against my temples. "Just stop." The whispers ceased. Relieved, I set the mug down and exhaled. But then a loud bang erupted from the attic, making me jump out of my seat. This time I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace and marched upstairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The attic door was slightly ajar. The whispering resumed, louder now, almost mocking me. My grip on the fire poker tightened as I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The attic was empty. It was just as I remembered it from childhood. dusty wooden beams, old trunks, and a single rocking chair by the window. The chair creaked, rocking back and forth on its own. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. The rocking chair came to an abrupt halt. I backed out of the attic, slamming the door shut and bolting it with trembling hands. Whatever was up there, I didn't want to see it. The next morning, I called my dad. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tense. "Why didn't you want the house?" I blurted. "What's in the attic?" There was a long pause. "You didn't open the door, did you?" he finally asked. I didn't answer. "Damn it, Alex," he hissed. "We told you to leave that house alone." "What's in the attic?" I repeated, my frustration boiling over. "Your grandmother, she wasn't well toward the end," he admitted. "She claimed there was something in the attic, a spirit or a demon, I don't know. She became obsessed with it. Your grandfather tried to stop her, but what? She locked herself up there, for days. When we finally broke down the door, she was gone." "Gone?" I echoed. "What do you mean, gone?" "There was nothing left, just that damn rocking chair." That night, the footsteps returned. But this time, they didn't stay in the attic. They descended the stairs. I sat in the living room, clutching the fire poker, as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The temperature dropped, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You're not real." The footsteps stopped at the doorway. The rocking chair appeared in the hall, its wood scraped and splintered. It rocked back and forth, as if something unseen was sitting in it. Then the whispers came back, louder, more forceful, filling the room with their chaotic symphony. The walls shook, and the lights flickered, and then I saw her. My grandmother, or what used to be her, crawled out of the shadows, her body twisted and broken, her face a mask of anguish. Her mouth opened, but instead of words, the whispers poured out, deafening and endless. I screamed, swinging the fire poker wildly, but it passed through her like smoke. She reached out, her skeletal fingers brushing my face, and everything went dark. I woke up outside, sprawled in the snow. The house was gone, reduced to a smouldering pile of ash. The fire marshal said it must have been an electrical fault, but I knew better. I left that town and never looked back. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear the whispers, calling me back. The Whispering Dunes. When my wife, Sarah, and I planned our road trip through the Southwest, we imagined starry skies, red rock canyons, and the quiet solitude of the desert. What we didn't anticipate was that the silence could hold something darker. We had booked a remote Airbnb on the edge of a massive desert preserve in Nevada. The photos showed a charming adobe-style cabin surrounded by endless sand dunes. It looked like the perfect escape. No neighbors, no noise, just us and the desert. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, though the GPS signal faded about an hour before we arrived. The road turned into a bumpy dirt path, winding through dunes that seemed to shift in the breeze. By the time we pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the sands. The cabin itself was cozy but basic. A single story, with a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a sitting area. The owner had left a note. "Welcome to the Whispering Dunes. Enjoy your stay and remember, don't wander the desert after dark." It seemed like an odd warning, but I chalked it up to the usual concerns about getting lost in the wilderness. Sarah, ever the optimist, joked, "Maybe they're worried we'll find buried treasure." I laughed, but something about the note left a sour taste in my mouth. That first evening was peaceful. We cooked dinner, watched the stars, and marveled at the sheer quiet of the desert. No cars, no planes, just the occasional rustle of the wind. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, it became clear. Someone was whispering. The words were indistinct, like a voice carried on the breeze, but it was unmistakably human. I nudged Sarah awake. "Do you hear that?" She groaned and sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Hear what?" We both listened. The whispering had stopped. "Probably just the wind," she said, lying back down. But I wasn't convinced. The sound had been too deliberate, too alive. The next morning, I went outside to clear my head. The desert was stunning in the early light, the dunes glowing a soft gold. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Footprints. They weren't ours. These were larger, barefoot, and scattered in erratic patterns around the cabin. "Sarah!" I called, my voice trembling. She came out, squinting against the sun. When she saw the footprints, her face paled. "Maybe someone's camping nearby," she suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. We decided to hike the dunes, hoping to find some sign of another traveler. But the sand stretched endlessly, unbroken except for the occasional scrub bush. By the time we returned to the cabin, the footprints had vanished, erased by the shifting sands. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time, Sarah heard them too. We sat in the dark, clutching each other, as the voices grew closer, circling the cabin. They spoke in a language we didn't recognize, a guttural rhythmic chant that made my skin crawl. Then came the scratching. It started at the windows, a faint, scraping sound, like nails dragging against glass. Then it moved to the walls, the door, even the roof. "Is someone out there?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, though I doubted any someone could make those sounds. We stayed up all night, too scared to sleep, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. The next morning, we found something that made our blood run cold. Carved into the wooden door was a single word: "Leave." The letters were jagged, uneven, as if scratched by claws or crude tools. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice shaking. I didn't argue, but as we packed our things, I noticed something strange. The dunes outside the cabin had changed. Where before they had been smooth, now they were marked by deep, swirling patterns, like enormous fingers had dragged through the sand. And in the distance, barely visible against the horizon, stood a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its outline shimmering in the heat haze. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "Let's just go." We loaded the car and sped down the dirt road, the cabin disappearing behind us. But as we drove, the whispers followed. They weren't outside this time, they were in the car. The voices rose and fell, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. Sarah clapped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop!" she screamed. I floored the gas pedal, the car bouncing over the rough road. Then out of nowhere, a figure stepped into our path. I swerved, narrowly missing it, and the car skidded to a stop. Was that? Sarah started, but I shook my head. I didn't want to know. When we finally reached the main highway, the whispers stopped. The silence was almost as unnerving as the noise had been. We drove straight to the nearest town, a tiny dot on the map called Redwater. At a diner, we told the waitress about our experience. She listened, her face growing grim. "You were at the Whispering Dunes," she said. I nodded. "What's the deal with that place?" She hesitated, then leaned in close. "They say the dunes are haunted by the spirits of those who got lost out there. People who died alone, their bodies never found. They whisper to travelers, trying to lure them into the desert. Once you go far enough, you're theirs." Sarah and I exchanged a glance, the weight of her words sinking in. We didn't go back for our things. To this day, I can't hear the wind without straining to make sure it's not whispering my name. The shadows of St. Eustace Abbey. I've always considered myself a skeptic, someone who doesn't buy into ghost stories or urban legends. That's why, when my friend Mark dared me to spend the weekend at St. Eustace Abbey, I couldn't say no. The Abbey had a dark reputation in our town. Built in the early 1800s, it was abandoned after a mysterious fire killed several monks in their sleep. Local legends spoke of shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the halls, and a bell that rang, even though the tower had collapsed long ago. It was the kind of place teenagers dared each other to visit, but no one ever stayed the night. Until us. Mark, his girlfriend Rachel, and I packed some supplies and headed out on a Friday night. The Abbey was a good hour's drive from town, nestled in a forest that seemed to grow darker as we approached. "We'll prove it's just a bunch of old bricks and creaky floorboards," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. Mark grinned. "Or maybe we'll meet the ghost of a pissed-off monk." Rachel rolled her eyes. "Let's just get this over with." The Abbey was more imposing than I'd imagined. Its crumbling stone walls loomed against the night sky, and the skeletal remains of the bell tower reached up like a claw. The air was colder here, and the forest seemed to press in on all sides. We set up camp in what used to be the dining hall, a large open space with a vaulted ceiling and long wooden tables, now warped with age. Our flashlights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. "Creepy as hell," Mark said, lighting a small camping stove. Rachel shivered. "Let's just stay here, okay? No wandering around." "Agreed," I said, though a part of me was curious about the other rooms. It started around midnight. We were sitting by the stove, eating canned soup, when we heard it. The faint toll of a bell, coming from somewhere above us. Rachel froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Tell me you heard that." Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances. "It's just the wind," I said, though my voice lacked confidence. Mark shook his head. "No way! That was a bell." He grabbed his flashlight and stood. "I'm checking it out." Rachel grabbed his arm. "Don't! It's not safe." "Come on, it's just an old building," Mark said, shrugging her off. Reluctantly, I followed him. I wasn't about to let him wander around alone, and truthfully, I wanted to see for myself. We found the staircase that led to the bell tower, or what was left of it. The steps were worn and covered in debris, but they held our weight as we ascended. The bell tolled again, louder this time, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. When we reached the top, there was nothing but open sky where the bell tower should have been. The roof had collapsed years ago, and the bell itself was nowhere to be seen. Mark frowned. "Okay, that's weird." I nodded, my heart pounding. "Let's go back." As we turned to leave, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darker than the night, moving across the ruins. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Mark didn't answer. He was staring at the same spot, his flashlight trembling in his hand. By the time we returned to the dining hall, Rachel was pale and trembling. "What happened?" Mark asked. She pointed to the far wall, her voice barely above a whisper. There were voices. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they were right here. I glanced at the wall, but there was nothing unusual about it, just cracked stone and peeling paint. "We're leaving," I said firmly. Mark shook his head. "No way. We just got here." "Mark, this isn't funny anymore," Rachel snapped. "Something's wrong." Before we could argue further, the bell tolled again, louder than ever. This time, it was accompanied by a low, guttural chanting that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the room, but the light only seemed to deepen the shadows. And then we saw it. It stepped out of the darkness, a figure cloaked in black, its face hidden beneath a hood. Its form seemed to ripple, as if it were made of smoke, and its eyes glowed faintly red. None of us moved. None of us breathed. The figure raised an arm, pointing at us with a skeletal hand. The chanting grew louder, the words foreign and menacing, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning wood. "Run!" I whispered. Rachel bolted first, Mark and I close behind. The chanting followed us, echoing through the halls, and the shadows seemed to come alive, reaching for us with clawed fingers. We didn't stop until we were deep in the heart of the abbey, our flashlights flickering in the suffocating darkness. "We have to get out of here," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "We're lost," Mark admitted. I scanned the room and realized we were in the catacombs, a labyrinth of stone tunnels where the monks had once buried their dead. The walls were lined with niches, each one holding a crumbling skeleton. "We can't stay here," I said, fighting the rising panic. As we turned to leave, the chanting returned, closer this time. The shadows moved again, coalescing into the form of the monk. It stepped forward, blocking our path, and raised its hand. The air grew cold, and the chanting seemed to seep into my skull, filling my mind with dread. I don't remember how we found the exit. One moment we were surrounded by shadows. The next we were stumbling into the icy night. The abbey loomed behind us, silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. But the faint toll of the bell followed us all the way to the car. None of us spoke as we drove back to town. We never talked about what happened that night, but I know we all remember. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint toll of a bell, and the memory of those glowing red eyes sends a chill down my spine. St. Eustace Abbey still stands, a monument to something dark and ancient, and I know deep down that it's waiting for someone else to wander inside. The Watcher in the Walls. When my wife, Lauren, and I bought the old house on Blackridge Lane, we thought it was a steal, a charming fixer-upper nestled in a quiet neighbourhood just outside town. The house had stood empty for years, but we were excited to restore it and call it home. Sure, it needed work. Peeling wallpaper, squeaky floorboards, and the faint smell of dampness were minor hurdles compared to the potential it held. From the moment we moved in, though, something felt off. It wasn't the kind of unease you could pinpoint, just a lingering sensation like being watched. I brushed it off as jitters from moving into a new, unfamiliar space. One weekend, we decided to tackle the renovations head-on. The first project was the living room, starting with removing the floral patterned wallpaper that had probably been in style in the 70s. Lauren handed me a putty knife, and we got to work peeling away decades of outdated decor. That's when I saw it. Underneath the wallpaper, scrawled in faded, jagged handwriting, was a single word: "Hello." I stared at it, confused. The word was written in what looked like charcoal, smeared slightly, but still legible. "Did you write this as a joke?" I asked Lauren. She looked over, her brow furrowed. "What? No, that's weird." We laughed it off at first. Maybe it was the work of a bored teenager who lived here decades ago. We kept peeling, revealing more of the wall beneath. That's when we found more words. "I see you. Stay out. Help me." Lauren stepped back, her face pale. "Okay, that's creepy. Maybe we should call it a day." But I was too intrigued to stop. The words seemed to grow more frantic as we uncovered more of the wall, like they'd been scrawled in desperation. There was one phrase that kept repeating over and over. "Don't let him in." That night, we couldn't shake the unease. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows, and the house creaked with every gust. Lauren joked that the house was trying to scare us off. I didn't laugh. The next few nights were restless. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing faint noises, scratching like fingernails on wood. At first, I thought it was a mouse in the walls, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Lauren heard it too. We both sat up in bed one night, staring at the wall across from us, the faint scraping sound growing louder. "Do you think it's just the house settling?" Lauren whispered. I nodded, not wanting to admit how unnerved I felt. But deep down, I knew the sound wasn't normal. Things escalated quickly after that. One evening, we were sitting on the couch watching TV when we heard a loud thud from upstairs. It was so sudden and forceful that it made the chandelier sway. "Did something fall?" Lauren asked, already on her feet. We crept upstairs together, the floorboards groaning beneath our weight. In the guest bedroom, a picture frame that had been hanging on the wall was now lying shattered on the floor. But it hadn't just fallen. It had been flung across the room. The nail it had hung from was still embedded in the wall, untouched. "I don't like this," Lauren said, her voice shaking. "This doesn't feel normal." The final straw came about a week later. I was working late in the office downstairs when I heard Lauren call out from the kitchen. "Ryan, come here!" I rushed in to find her standing frozen in front of the chalkboard we used to write grocery lists. Scrawled across it in large, jagged letters was a single sentence. "Get out or die." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "Who did this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The doors were locked, and the windows hadn't been touched. Lauren shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know." We barely slept that night, and when we did, it was fitful and full of nightmares. I dreamed of a shadowy figure standing in the corner of our room, watching us with glowing red eyes. The next morning we found more writing, not on the chalkboard this time, but directly on the walls in the hallway. The same jagged script as before, this time saying, "He's here." By now, we were both at our breaking point. I called a contractor to come inspect the house, thinking maybe there was mold or something else causing hallucinations. But the contractor found nothing out of the ordinary, just an old house with a lot of history. That evening, as we were getting ready for bed, the temperature in the house plummeted. Our breath fogged in the air, and the faint scratching noise returned louder than ever. Lauren clung to me, tears streaming down her face. "We can't stay here, Ryan. We have to leave." Before I could respond, a deafening bang came from the living room. We ran downstairs to find the coffee table flipped over, the couch cushions scattered across the floor. And in the center of the room stood a dark, humanoid figure. its body shrouded in shadow, its face obscured but somehow more terrifying for its absence of features. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us. I grabbed Lauren's hand and yanked her toward the front door. But when I tried to open it, the door wouldn't budge. The shadow figure began to advance, its footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. Desperate, I grabbed the crucifix my grandmother had given me from the wall and held it out. "Leave us alone!" I shouted. The figure stopped, its form flickering like a bad signal on a TV. Then, with a bone-chilling wail, it vanished. We didn't wait around to see if it would come back. We grabbed what we could carry and drove to a motel on the edge of town. The next day, we contacted a local historian to ask about the house's history. What we learned made my blood run cold. The house had once been a part of a psychiatric hospital that burned down in the 1930s. Patients had been moved into nearby properties temporarily, including our house. One patient, a man named Victor Hensley, had been infamous for his obsession with watching people. He believed he could see their darkest secrets by staring into their eyes. When the hospital burned, Victor escaped. But he was never found. We never went back to the house. Whatever was in those walls, Victor, or something worse, could keep it. The Midnight Choir. I never intended to get involved in the paranormal. In fact, I spent most of my adult life actively avoiding anything remotely spooky. Ghost tours? No thanks. Horror movies? Hard pass. But life has a funny way of throwing you directly into the things you fear most. And for me, it all started with a little town called Stonemill. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Stonemill was the kind of place you'd only find if you were lost. The roads twisted like a serpent, the trees so dense they blocked out most of the sunlight. My friend Eric had convinced me to join him on a photography trip, promising unspoiled beauty and rustic charm. I should have known better. Eric had an uncanny knack for finding places that gave you the creeps. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the golden light casting long shadows over the dilapidated buildings. Stonemill looked abandoned, though there were signs of life. Smoke curling from chimneys, a curtain twitching in a window, the faint hum of a generator. But there were no people, not a single soul in sight. "This is perfect," Eric said, practically bouncing out of the car with his camera. "Look at that atmosphere. It's like the town's frozen in time." I didn't share his enthusiasm. The place felt wrong. The kind of wrong you can't explain, only feel, like a pressure in the air or a faint buzzing in your ears. We found an old inn at the edge of town, a creaky 2-story building with a sagging roof and a faded sign that read Stonemill Lodge. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harker, greeted us with a tight-lipped smile and keys to a room on the second floor. "Stay inside after dark," she said, her voice low. "The choir sings at midnight." Eric and I exchanged a glance. "What choir?" I asked. Mrs. Harker's eyes flicked to the window, her expression unreadable. "You'll hear them," she said. "Best not to answer." We settled into our room, an oddly spacious suite with a large window overlooking the main street. Eric was thrilled, snapping pictures of the peeling wallpaper and antique furniture. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off, it began. A low, mournful hum, like a church hymn sung by a congregation of the dead. It started faintly, growing louder and more discordant, as if the voices were overlapping in unnatural ways. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Eric sat up, his eyes wide. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" We crept to the window and peered outside. The street was empty, but the sound was everywhere, reverberating through the walls and into my chest. "Maybe it's a local thing," Eric suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. I wanted to believe him, but something about those voices felt wrong. The next day, we explored the woods surrounding the town. Eric was in his element, snapping pictures of moss-covered rocks and gnarled trees. But as we ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, the silence oppressive. And then we found it. A clearing filled with old, weathered gravestones, their inscriptions eroded by time. At the center stood a massive oak tree, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers. Tied to the trunk was a bundle of sticks and bones, bound with red string. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric knelt to take a photo. "Some kind of folk art, maybe? Or a warning?" "Let's get out of here," I said, my skin crawling. Eric laughed, but he didn't argue. That night, the choir returned, louder and more insistent. The voices seemed to swirl around the inn, rising and falling in a haunting melody. And then the knocking started. It was soft at first, like a branch tapping against the window. But it grew louder, more forceful, until it echoed through the room. Eric grabbed a flashlight. "Stay here," he said, heading for the door. "Are you insane?" I hissed, but he was already gone. I waited, heart pounding, as the knocking grew more erratic. It wasn't just at the door anymore. It was at the windows, the walls, the floor. And then, silence. I crept to the window and peeked outside. Eric was standing in the street, staring at something I couldn't see. "Eric!" I called, but he didn't respond. I ran downstairs, my fear outweighed by my need to get him back inside. When I reached him, I saw what had captured his attention. A line of figures was moving down the street, their faces obscured by hoods. They carried candles that cast flickering light on their pale hands, and their voices joined in that unholy hymn. Eric turned to me, his face ashen. "We have to follow them." "No," I said firmly. "We're going back to the inn." But he was already walking, drawn like a moth to the flame. I followed, cursing under my breath. The procession led us to a crumbling church at the edge of town. The doors creaked open, revealing a cavernous interior lit by dozens of candles. The figures filed inside, their song reaching a fever pitch. Eric stepped over the threshold, and I grabbed his arm. "Don't!" I pleaded, but he shook me off and entered. The door slammed shut behind him. I banged on it, screaming his name, but the wood wouldn't budge. And then the singing stopped. When the door finally opened, the church was empty. The candles had burned down to stubs, and the air was thick with the smell of wax and decay. Eric was gone. I searched the town, the woods, even the graveyard, but there was no trace of him. When I returned to the inn, Mrs. Harker was waiting. "He's with them now," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "Who are they?" I demanded. She didn't answer. I left Stonemill the next morning, but I've never stopped hearing the choir. It follows me, growing louder with each passing night. And now, as I write this, the knocking has started again. I fear that soon I'll join their ranks. The Watchman. When I saw the ad for a caretaker position in the Appalachian Mountains, I thought it was perfect. A month alone in an old ranger station, looking after the trails during the off-season, with nothing but books and silence to keep me company. The pay wasn't much, but I didn't need much. I wanted peace. What I got was something else entirely. The station was deep in the woods, at the top of a winding dirt road. It had once been used by park rangers to monitor the forest and assist hikers, but with budget cuts and dwindling visitors, it had been abandoned. Now, they hired seasonal caretakers like me to maintain the place during winter. The house itself was modest. A 2-story cabin with creaky wooden floors, a wood stove, and a radio that crackled with static more often than it picked up a signal. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction, blanketed in snow. I arrived just before dusk on the first day of December, my car barely making it up the icy road. The ranger who handed me the keys, an older man named Ben, didn't linger. "Keep to the station and the marked trails," he warned, his breath visible in the freezing air. "And don't go wandering at night." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but his expression remained serious. "Why?" I asked. "People have gotten lost," he said, glancing at the darkening woods, "and sometimes they're not alone out there." I wanted to press him for details, but he muttered something about needing to get home before dark and left before I could ask. I stood on the porch, watching his taillights disappear down the road, leaving me alone with the cold and the silence. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my mornings clearing snow from the trails, my afternoons chopping wood for the stove, and my evenings reading by candlelight. The solitude was exactly what I'd hoped for. At night, the forest was eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just the occasional groan of trees under the weight of the snow. It was unsettling at first, but I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. On the 5th night, I heard it. It started as a faint tapping on the window near the kitchen. I froze, the book in my hands forgotten, and strained to listen. Tap, tap, tap. I told myself it was a branch, maybe a bird, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Just my reflection staring back at me in the frosted glass. I locked the door and went to bed, convincing myself it was nothing. The next day, I found footprints in the snow outside the station. They were large, too large to belong to any animal, and led from the woods to the window where I'd heard the tapping. I followed them into the trees, hoping to find some logical explanation. But the tracks didn't lead anywhere. They simply stopped in the middle of a clearing, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I returned to the station, unsettled, but determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. That night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. It moved from window to window, circling the house. I sat in the dark, clutching a flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice breaking the silence. The tapping stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I grabbed the fire poker from the stove and threw open the door, expecting to find a bear or a trespasser. The porch was empty. The snow was untouched. The next morning, I searched the cabin for clues. In the small office on the 2nd floor, I found an old ranger's journal tucked away in a drawer. The entries were mundane at first, reports of trail conditions, weather updates. But as I read further, they grew strange. December 3rd. Heard tapping on the windows again last night. Thought it was the wind, but the pattern was too deliberate. I've started locking the doors, just in case. December 7th. Found footprints near the station. Looked human, but too big. Followed them into the woods, but they disappeared. I'm starting to feel like I'm being watched. December 10th. Saw something in the trees, tall, pale, with eyes that glowed in the dark. It didn't move, just stared. I didn't sleep last night. The final entry was dated December 13th. If you're reading this, don't stay. Leave now. It won't let you go once it's seen you. The shadow in the woods. That night, the tapping turned to pounding. The entire house shook as if something massive was trying to force its way inside. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, clutching the fire poker and praying for morning. The pounding stopped just before dawn, leaving me with an uneasy silence that felt worse than the noise. When I finally ventured outside, I found claw marks on the walls of the cabin, long, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. I decided to leave. Packing my things, I kept glancing out the windows, expecting to see something watching me. The forest felt alive, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. As I loaded the last of my bags into the car, I heard it. A low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I turned and saw it, standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, impossibly tall, with pale, stretched skin and glowing eyes. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnatural. I jumped into the car and slammed the door, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the icy road without looking back. I made it to town, shaking and breathless. The locals didn't seem surprised when I told them what had happened. "The watchman," one of them said, "an old man with a knowing look. He guards the woods, keeps people out who don't belong. I left the Appalachian Mountains and never returned. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear tapping on my windows, and I wonder if it's followed me home." The Keeper of the Winter Woods. If you've ever driven through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in winter, you know how isolated it feels. The endless stretch of white-laden pines, the deserted roads, the biting wind howling through the trees. It's both beautiful and unsettling. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. My girlfriend Hannah and I decided to spend the holidays in a remote cabin that belonged to her late grandfather. It was her idea, a way to escape the chaos of city life and enjoy a quiet Christmas together. I was hesitant at first. Hannah had warned me the place was rustic, which was her polite way of saying it lacked electricity and running water. But she was excited, so I agreed. We loaded the car with supplies, drove 6 hours north, and arrived just before sunset. The cabin was perched on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by dense forest. It looked like something out of a postcard, with smoke curling from the chimney and icicles dangling from the roof. "It's perfect," Hannah said, her cheeks flushed from the cold. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept over me as I stared at the dark woods. The cabin was colder than I expected. The wood stove struggled to keep the place warm, and the wind outside rattled the windows like an unwelcome guest. After dinner, we sat by the fire, sipping hot cocoa and listening to the eerie silence that only deep winter can bring. Hannah seemed at ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. "Did your grandfather spend much time up here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She nodded. "He used to tell me stories about the forest, said it was alive in ways people don't understand." "What kind of stories?" She hesitated, then laughed. "Just old folklore. He said the woods had a keeper, some kind of spirit or guardian that watched over it. He called it Skogsherre, the forest lord. Supposedly, it didn't like strangers." I chuckled nervously. Sounds like a great way to scare kids. Hannah shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe he was warning me. The next morning, I went outside to chop wood while Hannah prepared breakfast. The air was crisp, and the snow sparkled like a field of diamonds under the pale sun. That's when I saw them, tracks in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too deliberate, and the stride was far too long. They looked almost human, but the toes were elongated, claw-like, as if something had walked barefoot through the snow. "Hey, Hannah," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. She came to the door, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's up?" I pointed at the tracks. Her face paled. "It's probably a bear," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew better. That night, the wind picked up, shrieking through the trees like a chorus of wailing voices. The cabin creaked and groaned, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to dance with a life of their own. Around midnight, we heard it, a low, guttural sound like the growl of a predator. Hannah sat up in bed, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, gripping the flashlight I'd placed on the nightstand. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the crunch of snow underfoot. It was circling the cabin. I crept to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I peered outside. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, just at the edge of the tree line, something moved. It was tall, easily 8 feet, and cloaked in shadow. Its limbs were impossibly long, and its glowing yellow eyes cut through the darkness like twin lanterns. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "What is it?" Hannah whispered. I couldn't answer. The next morning, we found something on the porch. A bundle of sticks, tied with a strip of leather, sat just outside the door. Embedded in the leather was a tooth, long, sharp, and yellowed with age. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, picking it up. "Put it back," Hannah said, her voice trembling. "What?" "Just put it back." She wouldn't explain, but the fear in her eyes was enough. I placed the bundle back where I'd found it and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, the growling returned, louder and more insistent. The cabin shook as something massive slammed against the walls, and the windows rattled as if they were about to shatter. Hannah clutched my arm, her face pale. "It wants us to leave," she whispered. "Leave and go where?" I snapped. "We're snowed in." The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then we heard it, a voice deep and resonant, speaking a language I didn't understand. Hannah's eyes widened. "It's the Skogsherre." "Okay, what the hell is that?" She swallowed hard. "The Forest Lord. My grandfather said it protects the woods. If it thinks you're a threat, it removes you." "How?" She didn't answer, but the look on her face said it all. We didn't sleep that night. As dawn broke, we packed our bags and prepared to leave. The tracks surrounded the cabin, dozens of them, as if whatever had been watching us had multiplied. We trudged through the snow, our breath clouding the frigid air, the car just visible in the distance. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the trees themselves were watching us. When we reached the car, I turned to look back at the cabin. It was there, standing at the edge of the forest. Its elongated limbs swayed unnaturally, and its glowing eyes burned into me. It raised one clawed hand, pointing directly at me. "Drive," Hannah whispered. I didn't need to be told twice. We made it back to the city, shaken but alive. I haven't been back to the woods since, but sometimes, Late at night, I hear the wind howl, and I swear it carries a voice. A deep, guttural whisper that speaks words I can't understand, and I wonder if the forest lord let me leave, or if it's waiting for me to return. The night train to nowhere. There's something about train stations at night that feels both eerie and nostalgic. The air hangs heavy with the echoes of conversations past, and the distant clatter of trains is like a whisper from another world. I had no business being at that station, not at 2:47 a.m. and certainly not alone. I had missed my connecting train to get home, stranded in a town I didn't know, with no taxis or hotels in sight. The station was nearly empty, just a bored clerk behind a glass window and a flickering schedule board. The clerk had told me about the night train. "It's not on the official schedule," he'd said, his voice low as if he were telling me a secret. "It comes through once every few nights. Stops on platform 7. It's your best chance if you're desperate to get out of here." Something about the way he said desperate made my stomach twist, but I nodded anyway. Desperation was an apt description of my state. So there I was, on platform 7, staring down an empty set of tracks under a sky smeared with clouds. The air was unnaturally still, like the world itself was holding its breath. At 3:13 a.m., I heard it, a low, rumbling whistle in the distance. The train emerged from the darkness like a serpent, its engine a hulking black monstrosity spewing clouds of steam that glowed faintly under the platform lights. It slowed as it approached, the screech of its brakes setting my teeth on edge. When it stopped, its doors hissed open, and I hesitated. There were no announcements, no passengers disembarking, no conductor waving me aboard. Just the open doors, like a silent invitation. I glanced back at the platform. The clerk was gone, the station empty. The train let out another long, mournful whistle, and something in my chest tightened. Against my better judgment, I stepped aboard. Inside, the train was dimly lit, its seats upholstered in faded red fabric. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing down the corridor. No answer. I walked through the car, the soles of my shoes sticking slightly to the floor. There were no other passengers, no signs of life at all. The doors behind me slid shut with a hiss, and the train jolted forward, the sudden motion nearly knocking me off my feet. Panic bubbled up in my chest as I hurried to the nearest seat and sat down. The window beside me was grimy, but I could just make out the darkness outside as the train picked up speed. For a while, I tried to calm myself. Maybe this was just an old, forgotten train, running a route for the few stragglers who needed it. Maybe I'd arrive at my destination and laugh about this tomorrow. But then I noticed the lights. They flickered, not just in the way old bulbs sometimes do, but in a pattern, almost like Morse code. And in the brief moments of darkness, I thought I saw shapes moving in the reflection of the glass. The first passenger boarded at the next stop. I didn't hear the train slow down or the doors open, but suddenly he was there, sitting 2 rows ahead of me. He was a large man, his shoulders hunched, his head low. He wore a suit that looked decades out of fashion, and his hands, large and gnarled, rested heavily on his knees. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tentative. "Do you know where this train is headed?" He didn't respond, didn't even turn his head. "Sir?" Still nothing. I stood, inching closer. "Sir, can you—" His head snapped around so fast I stumbled back into my seat. His face was wrong. His eyes were black pits, his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin that stretched far too wide. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity. And then, Just as suddenly, he turned back around, his body stiff as a mannequin. I didn't try speaking to him again. The train continued its journey, stopping periodically to let more passengers on. But they weren't normal passengers. One was a woman in a tattered dress, her hair hanging in damp, matted strands over her face. She sat by the window, muttering to herself in a language I couldn't understand. Another was a child, a little girl clutching a ragged teddy bear. She sat across from me, her pale blue eyes staring unblinkingly into mine. More came, silent, spectral figures that filled the seats, each more unsettling than the last. None of them spoke to me, but I could feel their presence, heavy and oppressive. The air grew colder with each stop, my breath visible in the dim light. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands trembling. "What is this?" I whispered to myself. "This is the night train," a voice answered. I jumped, spinning around to find a man sitting behind me. He hadn't been there before. He was older, his face lined with age, his eyes weary. Unlike the others, he looked normal. "You shouldn't have boarded," he said. "I didn't know," I stammered. "You'll have to pay the fare," he interrupted, his voice grave. "Everyone does." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but before I could, the train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing nothing but darkness outside. One by one, the passengers stood and shuffled off the train, disappearing into the void. "Wait!" I called after them. "Where are you going?" The old man didn't move. He just stared at me with those tired eyes. "They're paying their fare," he said. I looked out into the darkness, my heart pounding. "I don't understand." "You will." Suddenly, the lights in the car went out, plunging me into darkness. I felt something cold and clammy brush against my arm, and I scrambled back, my breathing ragged. When the lights flickered back on, the old man was gone. The train jolted forward again, faster this time. The windows rattled, and the air grew even colder. Then he appeared. The conductor. He was tall, his uniform crisp and immaculate. But his face was a mask of shadows, shifting and swirling like smoke. "Ticket, please," he said, his voice a low growl. I don't have one," I stammered. He tilted his head, the shadows twisting into something that resembled a grin. "Then you'll have to pay another way." "What does that mean?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. The conductor didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his hand a skeletal claw, and touched my forehead. Pain exploded in my skull, and I screamed. When I woke up, the train was gone. I was lying on the platform of a different station, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been wrung dry. I staggered to my feet, looking around. The station was deserted, and there was no sign of the night train, but I wasn't alone. In my pocket, I found a single ticket. It was black, with silver lettering that read, "Admit 1, the night train," and etched below it, in small jagged letters, was my name. Thanks for joining our spooky story time. Bloody subscribe and keep the nightmares coming. Good night.